The theme for this month is stories. And stories are powerful and can be life-changing. They can transform us. They can reframe our thinking about important issues. But only if we listen to them. Only if we really, really listen to them. And the Canadian writer Richard Wagamese, who's an indigenous writer from the Ojibwe tribe, says this. He says, "What's important should be repeated 3 times. What's important should be repeated 3 times. I'm only going to say that twice. You listen the first time. You hear the second time. And you feel the third time. When you listen, you become aware. That's for your head. When you hear, you awaken. That's for your heart. And when you feel, it becomes part of you. That's for your spirit. 3 times. It's so you learn to listen with your whole being, because that's how you learn. And I love that idea of listening to be aware, awaken, and to feel. Because I think sometimes, and I'll speak for myself here and no one else, and I probably shouldn't tell you this, but it's confession time at the Unitarian Universalist Church. Sometimes I'm a sloppy listener. You know, sometimes I'm listening to respond to people. Sometimes I'm thinking about, when can I go and get my coffee? And we're not fully engaged with the person. And everyone, people who take the courage to share their story with us, deserve us to be fully listening to what they're saying, to listening to their story. And I love that idea of listening to become more aware. Because each of us here, we have experiences from our own background. But I have learned so much from those with identities different from mine, and realize we can be in the same place, experience the same thing, but have very, very different experiences about what happened and how people are treated. I know as a straight white male, I may get treated very differently in many places, very privileged in many places that other people don't experience. So by listening to other people's story, that can raise my awareness of how they might perceive it. And that's what I hope we achieve with the multiculturalism work that we're doing. It's about being able to see things from different perspectives. Can I see something from a feminist perspective? Can I see something from a queer perspective? Can I just even imagine what that would be like? Can I see that from a person of color perspective or other historically marginalized identities? Stories can raise that awareness for me. And then the second one, that's about hearing. What about listening? About awakening. What's the difference between awareness and awakening? Awareness brings something to your consciousness. I think awakening means you are somehow changed by that experience. And one of the things I've been doing over the last few months is exploring some of those well-known religious stories as a way of kind of enhancing our spiritual identities. I mentioned before the election that, you know, it's really dangerous to put a political identity at the center of who we are, and I really want to encourage all of us to put a spiritual identity there. And the story I want to share today about awakening comes from the Christian tradition. It's a story that's actually in all 4 Gospels. And it's a story you're probably all familiar with. It's the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus is speaking to this huge crowd, and he must be repeating everything 3 times because we're running late, and everyone's getting hungry. But they realize they've got very, very limited food. They've got 5 loaves and 2 fishes for 5,000 people. That would barely feed me. So he thinks, well, what can we do? And he said, no, and Jesus says to his disciples that, no, go ahead, we will have enough food, will be provided. And of course, that's a story that's often considered a miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. There was enough food somehow, and they ended up with 12 baskets of food left over. Well, that's one perspective. Being a Unitarian Universalist, I have another perspective. I wonder if people were inspired by the words of Jesus. Perhaps people were inspired by the community, the generosity, that they found, well, I have some food in my pocket. I mean, we have a miracle every Sunday in the social hall with the food after it and the endless supply of coffee, except for me, because it always runs out when I get there. But there is the idea that, we can be inspired to generosity. And I think that is a story. In that awakening, I think people were probably awakened to generosity. It's another possible interpretation of that story. And you think of the Buddhist tradition. I mean, Buddhism is all about awakening. The Buddha grew up very privileged, saw this extreme suffering in the world, lived as an ascetic, really poorly for 6 years. And he realized it wasn't about being super privileged, and it wasn't about living poorly. There was a happy medium in the middle. That was the great awakening that the Buddha realized. By living in the middle, by being aware of suffering and not trying to live to the extremes of society, could alleviate suffering. That was his awakening. So I invite each of you to think about, when you listen, are you open to become more aware from someone else's story? Do you listen to awaken, to open to the possibility of change? And do you really feel, because the great stories you listen to that we remember are the ones that cause us to feel, and through that we can be transformed. Awareness, awakening, and feeling to be transformed. I think that's how, when someone gives us the privilege of listening to their story, that's what we owe them.